the monitor. I used to work as a security guard, and I would, when I was in seminary, and I would look at these monitors. And it's interesting that those monitors themselves are not conscious. They are not aware. They're just basically, in a sense, giving you or giving input to you on what's out there. In a sense, you are the one who is doing the processing. You are the one who's taking it in. We are not simply cameras that are, in a sense, taking things in, but we're actually processing these things, that we are experiencing these things. And so the big question by many naturalists is, why does consciousness emerge at all? And David Papineau, the one we began with, who said, everyone these days wants to be a naturalist, he says that that consciousness, he says, this question of consciousness, he says, to this question, physicalists' theories of consciousness seem to provide no answer. So consciousness is a big problem when it comes to a naturalistic explanation, but not so with theism. If we've been made by a supremely self-aware being, then the existence of consciousness has a plausible context. What about the issue of free will and personal responsibility and truth-seeking? Well, a lot of people hold to this idea that we are genetically programmed to think certain ways. Richard Dawkins of Oxford University says that we are basically dancing to our DNA. One time I was on a plane. I'll speak plainly with you all here, for some of you that may have gone over your heads. But stick with me here. I was on a plane trip heading from the Atlanta area to Cape Cod, and I was sitting next to a gentleman who was a naturalist. And I happened to be working on my doctoral dissertation at the time. It was on the moral argument for God's existence, that God helps to make better sense out of objective moral values and human dignity and worth and so forth than a naturalistic scenario. And so this gentleman looked at me, and he had this kind of condescending look, like, oh, that's very charming that you're working on that sort of thing. How quaint. That there are people who still do this sort of thing, like I was maybe a caveman, or okay, maybe the Middle Ages or something like that, when people talked about these things. But he thought that I was hopelessly naive about accounting for objective moral values and so forth. So I asked him. I said, "Why do you think that that human beings have a conscience when they act morally and so forth?" He said, "Well, all that we do is an attempt to survive and reproduce." Well, I said to him, in other words, everything that we think, everything that we believe is nothing more than the product of just biological processes. He said, that's right. All that we do is an attempt to survive and reproduce. This is his mantra, so to speak. Well, I asked him the question, and I said, now, you believe that God doesn't exist, right? He said, that's right. And I said, no, I believe that God does exist. I said, that's right. Now, if we are determined by our genetics to believe the things that we do in an attempt to survive and reproduce, then how do you know that you are right and that I'm wrong? You have no control over those things that are being pumped into your mind. You're just dancing to your DNA, as Richard Dawkins says. Now, if God exists, then we can make sense out of seeking truth. But if all that we're doing is trying to survive and reproduce, then you don't have any sort of basis for saying this viewpoint is true, because it's just been pumped into you by your genetic makeup, by your nervous system, and so forth. It's sort of like the what the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Francis Crick said when he wrote the book The Astonishing Hypothesis. Now, Francis Crick is a naturalist. And he talks about the astonishing hypothesis that our joys and sorrows, our sense of identity and free will, he says, and I quote, they are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. But what's interesting is Francis Crick's own beliefs then would be nothing more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So Crick's beliefs aren't any more rational than anyone else's. If Crick is correct, then it's just by accident. And so no wonder the philosopher Richard Rorty says that the desire for truth is to be utterly un-Darwinian. Very interesting. The zoologist Jane Goodall sees moral responsibility and free will as distinctively human, in contrast to chimps and other animals. Well, what makes human beings so special? Well, if they've been made in the image of God, that makes perfect sense. She says, only humans, I believe, are capable of deliberate cruelty, acting with the intention of causing pain and suffering. Thomas Nagel, a philosopher and atheist at New York University, says there is no room for agency, for human action and choice in a world of neural impulses, chemical reactions, and bone and muscle movements. Naturalism, he says, implies that we're helpless and not responsible for our actions. So again, when you're looking at this scenario, you're saying, okay, do we have to go the naturalistic route and throw a lot of our, throw our rational faculties into question, that we are not really able to seek the truth, that if we hit the truth, then it's just by accident? Or does it make better sense of our intuitions that we can be truth-seeking beings, that God exists? So you see, if we really believe that truth exists, then we're actually moving in the direction of believing in a theistic frame of mind rather than a naturalistic one. And I know that people like Daniel Dennett and others, their books Elbow Room and so forth, they have tried to account for choice, responsibility, and so forth. But again, the question remains: if we are simply surviving beings, if we are simply trying to survive and reproduce, then why think that our beliefs are true? They may be utterly false, but they may help us to survive. So again, I can leave that for perhaps the Q&A time. Let me move on here with a couple of other issues. When it comes to objective moral values and human rights, consider the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which simply assumes the inherent worth and dignity of human beings. And a lot of naturalists do affirm that human beings have dignity and worth. Simon Blackburn, for example, says, he says, now, I would prefer dignity to humiliation, but of course he offers no grounds for saying why that's the case. Being a naturalist, it seems that from valuelessness comes. E.O. Wilson says that morality is simply a device of survival in social organisms. In other words, human beings ultimately don't have rights. If people like James Rachels or E.O. Wilson or Bertrand Russell and others are right. I mean, Bertrand Russell said that the whole subject of ethics arises from the pressure of the community on the individual. That's all there is to it. And so as we look at this whole scenario of the existence of God, God makes a lot more sense of why human beings have value and dignity and worth. If a good God exists in whose image we've been made, then we have a readily available basis for affirming objective moral values, human dignity and rights, and moral obligations. The atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie of Oxford said, moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they are most likely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Now, he says that they are odd, and if they do exist, then it would make sense that a God created them. But what J.L. Mackie went ahead and did was he denied that objective moral values exist at all. But if they do exist, if we do believe that human beings have rights and dignity and so forth, we're pointed in the direction of God rather than away from God, as the naturalist would have us believe. Now, the universe began to exist a finite time ago. And again, this confirms what Genesis 1:1 says: in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And today, Stephen Hawking, for example, the physicist from Cambridge, says almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, again I'm quoting all naturalists here, he acknowledges his dislike of this fact. He says the now rejected steady-state theory, again, which views the universe as eternally existent, is philosophically the most attractive theory because it least resembles the account given in Genesis. In other words, he would like for the steady-state theory to be true, but it just isn't, and he doesn't like that because the way things look now, it sounds like Genesis 1:1. Or astrophysicists John Barrow and Joseph Silk, they said our new picture is more akin to the traditional metaphysical picture of creation